Here we are, lecture 26, and a mad dash to the to the end of human history. This lecture is going to focus on pop art and postmodernism, but as you're going to see, particularly with postmodernism, that's a pretty broad term that encompasses a lot of things, perhaps even pop art itself. In fact, perhaps even reaching back to some of the artists we've discussed last week. It's a big confusing term that means a lot of things in a lot of different disciplines. You know, whether it's art, as in like painting, sculpture, all the other modes of art making, literature, architecture is a big part of postmodernism, but also philosophy, history. It touches on so many aspects of society, and so I encourage you to look at some of the links that are posted on the course site that go into a little more detail about postmodernism to try to clarify it. But don't expect to find anything like super neat and tidy. You're not going to understand, in quotes, postmodernism at the end of this week. You could probably study your whole life and not really understand postmodernism. But we're going to at least introduce it. So first of all, pop art. You could see precursors of pop art in the work of artists like Rauschenberg and Johns. But that evolves at some point into something that focuses on, in particular, incorporating imagery from consumer culture, mass media, and just popular culture in general. What you're looking at right now is as much as you can say, put a start date on anything. This is the very first artwork attributed to this new style of pop art. And it's a collage taken mostly from ads. Richard Hamilton, just what is it that makes today's home so different, so appealing? Richard Hamilton was a British artist, but it was mostly the Americans that left the biggest mark on pop art. Pop art was very conscientiously a reaction to the purity of abstract expressionism. And it celebrated everything that abstract expressionism distrusted. The pop artists saw abstract expressionism as high-minded and elitist, just a little too snooty and holier than thou. The pop artists glorified lowbrow culture and commercialism. Keep in mind, unlike the rest of the developed world, as problematic as that term is, that was devastated by the ravages of World War II, particularly in their economies, the United States was a shining beacon of opportunity, and the moral compass turns ever so slightly towards placing a value on material goods and creature comforts. And you could picture the abstract expressionists with their lofty notions of truth and beauty turning over in their graves. Pop art got its inspiration from packaging, from comic books, familiar images that were accessible to the average Joe. Andy Warhol, probably the most significant of the pop artists, emphasized commodity culture and dominance of brand. And, like I said, he's kind of the quintessential American pop artist. One quote, there's a quote here too, but another quote that's not on the slide from Andy Warhol that I don't know, he had a lot of like really eccentric ideas and really ironic, I read as ironic ways of looking at things, but said, what's great about this country is that America started the tradition where the richest consumers buy the exact same things as the poorest. You could be watching TV and see Coca-Cola, and you can know that the president drinks Coca-Cola. Liz Taylor drinks Coke, and just think, you could drink Coke too. A Coke is a Coke, and no matter how much money you have, you can't get a better Coke. Here in this quote on the slide, you can get a sense of this like kind of raw consumer culture. The reason I'm painting this way is that I want to be a machine, and I feel that whatever I do and do machine-like is what I want to do. We see in his work overwhelming repetition that represents the influence of advertising and consumer culture on society. Let's have a look at another. Here's an example of that repetition. Green Coca-Cola bottles. They're all the same, but actually they're not, if you look carefully. But here's this ubiquitous, iconic American image that represents pure corporate culture. And I don't know how you can't get irony out of that. Andy Warhol often made silk screens, a printmaking process, so he could mass produce images just like corporations mass produce consumer goods. It was a commodification of culture. And he called his studio the factory. Here's a snapshot from a typical ordinary evening at the factory. It was a hip hangout that doubled as an assembly line for his silk screens. And it became a meeting place for artists who are now, that we think of as being these world-class celebrities. People like Bob Dylan would hang out there, Mick Jagger, even Salvador Dali. It was all sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And Andy used it all in his work. To hear perhaps what the factory sounded like, you should look up the Velvet Underground and Nico, the full album on YouTube. I think I put a link to that on the course site, just in case you wanted to check it out. You can envision, by listening to that, you can envision the scene. It's been said that the Velvet Underground didn't sell many albums, but everyone who bought one went out and started their own band. Incredibly influential. Oh, and this, by the way, was the cover. Another pop artist was Roy Lichtenstein, and this is Blam from 1962. He took inspiration from comic books. Blam is based on an image from DC Comics in 1962, embraced comic book style by actually painting the dots which comprise the printed image. If you, this might be like, I guess you could look it up, but in the olden days, in printed imagery, like in newspapers, pictures were, a series of dots, and that's how these comics, if you zoomed up, you looked down with a magnifying glass, you'd see these tiny little blips of imagery, and then as you get back away from them, the color feels solid. But anyway, that's the way in which Lichtenstein applied the paint. It immortalized and elevated something disposable, and certainly thought of as lowbrow art, comic books. And we talked about how like pop art and abstract expressionism are kind of like the ideological opposites. Perhaps like the neoclassicists and romantics, or in reverse. I don't know. It's actually, that analogy doesn't work that well. But presumably, this was Lichtenstein's take on abstract expressionism. I'm sure meant to poke fun at it. Some artists in the later part of the 20th century thought that you don't really need an object at all to be art, and their works were labeled as conceptual art. For them, the idea is the most important part, and the form is secondary. Often the materials are not traditional art materials at all. They're ephemeral and ordinary. I think it's obvious that Marcel Duchamp was a big influence on what we called conceptual art in the later 20th century. Think of the ready-made. In fact, I think you could say Marcel Duchamp was probably the most influential artist of the entire 20th century. Conceptual art often lives on in documentation only, and so it can't be bought and sold in the same way that traditional art media can. And in fact, it's sort of a dematerialization of the art object. Here is Joseph Kosuth, 1 and 3 chairs from 1965, pointing out these 3 states of being of the chair. It can be an object, the chair sitting on the floor in front of the wall. It could be a picture, the photograph of that chair, taken from a similar angle as the photograph of the whole thing we're looking at. And then of course, the words. This is like kind of the words that describe a chair. All of these are ways of representing the basic banal fact of the chair. Conceptual artists pointed out that the fact that true art should be above such material things as commerce, kind of like the real opposite to the pop artists. And this idea of transcending the material concerns, think all the way back to the Byzantine mosaics we looked at, all the way back to Plato in ancient Greece. Works like Kosuth's explore the way aesthetic meaning is generated, and it's not about aesthetic pleasure per se. It's more about the idea, the concept being beautiful, rather than the soft fur on a puppy dog. Conceptual art often deals with empowering the viewer. The viewers really complete the meaning of the work. Sol LeWitt is a great example of an artist who goes so far as to even take the artist's physical action out of the equation. Sol LeWitt is known for mostly these wall drawings. And what happens is a set of instructions are sent to the gallery, and these drawings are executed by the gallery staff, following very specific directions laid out by the artist. And this further eroded the conventional notions of the art objects, of the art object. It could be removed and recreated according to instruction without the artist's hand at all. The idea becomes the machine that makes the art. It's the idea. And LeWitt thought of himself as more like a composer rather than like a craftsman. Again, go back to Kandinsky and Kandinsky's relationship to, Stravinsky and sound and music. So these ideas are original and new in a way, but they also you could find underpinnings in art history. Sol LeWitt's work often employed these geometric shapes, primary colors, and they were usually logical and ordered and very, very preconceived, utterly preconceived in the fact that it was totally laid out ahead of time. You wonder what it would be like to work in a gallery. It would be a lot of work creating these pieces. Minimalism is another important art form, art movement, period, because all these things are coexisting. But it's a predominantly sculptural trend of art in the 1960s and continued on from there. It's characterized by works featuring a severe reduction of form, often to single homogeneous units. Donald Judd was one important practitioner of this form of art, and he moved to Marfa, Texas, and set up a huge compound where his art could be seen in its intended context, which is a huge thing for minimalism, especially because there's not a whole lot there. It's about the artwork's relationship to its environment. I highly recommend checking out the Chinati Foundation the next time you're passing through West Texas. You can also see the Marfa Lights while you're at it. These two artists here, Robert Smithson and Walter Di Maria, are emblematic of another form of art, earthworks, sometimes called land art. On the left here, Spiral Jetty, this earthwork sculpture was constructed in 1970, and it was built entirely of mud, salt crystals, basalt rocks, earth, and water. And it's on the northeastern shore of the Great Salt Lake. It's a 1,500-foot long coil jutting from the shore of the lake. And it was constructed with bulldozers, and it's occupying a large swath of the landscape. Earthworks make those large abstract expressionist canvases seem quaint in scale. These are massive. The one on the right, the lightning field, was created in New Mexico by the sculptor Walter Di Maria. It consists of 400 stainless steel poles with solid pointed tips arranged in a rectangular 1 mile by 1 kilometer grid array. And the tops of these poles are all at the exact same elevation. So like despite the irregularities in the landscape, if you lined them up, the tops are all the exact same height, and which means that each pole individually is a different height from one another, depending on the contours of the land. But that identical elevation meant that when passing lightning storms would go by, there wasn't like one higher point that would get hit. And in fact, the whole point of this was to catch lightning. And you could rent a cabin to stay out in this lightning field, and literally only one group can go at a time. It's a very special art experience, and of course you got to reserve it years in advance, I think, and who knows if there's going to be a lightning storm in the particular day that you have reserved. But holy cow, could you imagine seeing the incredible flashes of lightning all around you? It'd be pretty amazing. And this brings us to performance art. Here we see a photographic image that is a part of a documentation of a performance. Performance art is art where basically someone acts. Someone does something. And I say act, that's not even the right word, because it's not like you're acting a part. You're performing an activity, an action yourself, basically. And it comes in all sorts of different forms, and holy cow, there are so many different interesting performance artists. For some reason, I chose to choose Chris Burden here. When I was in college and grad school, Chris Burden was the performance artist who most captured my attention, because he went to like radical lengths to create a spectacle in his art that conveyed a sense of conviction and like going all the way, like going as far as you can go. Some of his work includes setting up a gallery opening where people would show up and they're like, okay, where's the art? And then they see him standing in the corner, and suddenly somebody pulls back their coat and they have a gun, and they hold the gun out and they shoot Chris Burden in the arm. And that is the art piece. That was called Shoot. You can look it up. Performance art is often like over the top and often very confrontational and extreme. Here is an image of his piece Transfixed, where he has himself crucified to this Volkswagen Bug, like literally stakes going through his hands, pinning him to this bug as it sits in a garage. And then once he's there crucified, the garage door opens and this bug rolls out into the middle of traffic. Pretty nuts. Of course, these kind of spectacle things now, this was in the 1970s, I think in the 70s. This kind of spectacle now isn't like really, it's been co-opted by popular culture, and it's not, quite as like meaningful maybe as it was, earlier, but it's interesting, and you should. I think I posted some performance art stuff on the website too that you should check out. You can see that one by one, every rule and assumption about the nature of art is struck down. Since our last visit with the code book for Western art, you certainly don't need imagery. Kandinsky and abstract expressionism. You don't need to be anything special because everyday culture will do. Pop art. You don't need artistic skill. Like, think about Kossuth, we just looked at. You don't even need the artist to be there. Think about Sol LeWitt. You don't even need any kind of gallery space in which to exhibit the work. Think about Smithson or Di Maria. With performance art, you don't even need a resulting thing at all, except perhaps documentation of it, or else, did it really happen? You can imagine it would get harder and harder to be original, therefore modern. There's so much going on so fast, the rules are gone. History has played itself out. Perhaps. Maybe there's nothing left to be done that's truly original. Modernism is over. Somewhere along the line, postmodernism was born. And there's so much disagreement as to precisely when. In fact, I think the argument about when it happened is kind of pointless, because it isn't really a thing that happened. It's just, it dawns on us that that's what's going on. Time is no longer an arrow moving forward. In a lot of ways, history has smashed against a brick wall. And now anything goes. Wherein with high modernism, like the abstract expressionists, for example, individualism was like the preeminent important thing about artistic expression. Now collaboration is a much bigger part. Lots of mail art, and even more recently, over the internet, and people collaborating in ways that were unimaginable before. Appropriation is another hallmark of postmodernism, and that's taking something that has already been created and reusing it to your own ends. Very much like hip-hop artists in the 70s and 80s, New York DJs like DJ Kool Herc started sampling percussive elements from disco, soul, and funk on records and playing it back live to create a repetitive beat. Pastiche is incorporating various styles and periods into a single work of art, which is literally the antithesis of Greenberg's conception of modernism. It's like a medley of different influences all in a single piece, like Michael Graves' Municipal Services Building in Portland, Oregon. We see kind of elements that are almost like Egyptian, or maybe Minoan, or like it just comes from all different kinds of things. This is like totally not the modern aesthetic at all. There's nothing like kind of pure and streamlined about this. It like pulls from references from everywhere. Artists started bringing the experiencer into the realm of the art in a way that it kind of breaks the fourth wall. Art became self-referential, like the Robert Altman movie, The Player, that is a movie about making movies. Artwork becomes, it always had been kind of, art has always referred to itself and has always played on things from the past. But in the postmodern period, art has taken that in a much more direct, literal way than it had before. In the late 1960s and 70s, when art and politics and culture merged, as artists began to believe in a more socially and politically responsive form of art, we see artwork from a broad range of perspectives. And certainly no longer is there a centralized authority of what art should be. In the Renaissance, it was maybe Florence and Rome, and then Paris was the center of art. And then after World War II, then New York was the cultural center. But more and more, it's so decentralized as to there is no center. There's no like place where art happens more than any other. It feels like it's distributed all throughout the world. And so you see artists from these cultures that were never really represented in the past that become like very prominent mainstream artists, like Ai Weiwei, just one example from China. But you could point to artists from all over the world now that are contributing to the art tradition that are acknowledged, where before that wasn't the case. Simulated reality has been a part of art at least since the ancient Greeks. And something that postmodernism takes into account is this notion that fake reality can in some ways be even better than the real thing. Think about Disneyland or the Las Vegas Strip. It's like a cleansed version of the actual place or event. And it's that copy of reality that takes on its own reality, considered like Civil War reenactments that create their own vision of the past. Now you can actually feel like you're in Venice without going to Venice. Does this give you insight into the magical light that Titian saw? Well, probably not. But if you've ever been to Las Vegas, you know what I mean. Since at least the 1980s, simulacrum in movies and TV has been a huge part of the cutting edge work that's being done. And this is especially true of the last couple of years. But Blade Runner is an early example. It's about fake people, or rather robots that are indistinguishable from real people. That's something that even in the 1980s people could see on the horizon. As a movie, Blade Runner also fits into a larger cultural context of retromania. I think this love for the styles of the past is part of the broader concept of history as a brick wall that we have run into and exploded from there. And it's fetishizing of the past. Blade Runner was postmodern in several ways. The concept of androids that are indistinguishable from people plays into the simulacrum we just discussed. But the style of the film borrowed from the tradition of the 1940s film noir, as well as the science fiction, and it was a mashup of distinct periods of cinema. A popular line of thought amongst contemporary artists and thinkers is transhumanism, questioning of how enhanced technologies could permanently alter the very notion of what it means to be human. We have, or will soon have, the ability to modify the human body in ways that will increase endurance, mental capacity, lifespan, and even the way that we think through banal and subtle human alterations to our biology over years and years, and perhaps across many generations. Will people really be people anymore? Just like Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, will humanity, through technological developments, become something inherently different than what we are now? Contemporary philosophers like Nick Bostrom at Oxford University write about the technological possibility of extending human lifespan indefinitely. What would this mean to the way people live their lives, to the value of life itself, and the capacity for risk-taking? Or will artificial intelligence render all those concerns entirely moot? Perhaps we won't have to think at all. Just plug into our computers and bliss out forever and ever, just like what the little girls in The Shining say. Just so you know, these aren't new issues. The ancient Greek philosophers thought about the exact same things. It's just that these issues don't seem quite so hypothetical anymore. So what does all this mean for contemporary art? And what in the world could I show you in a slide that would convey in any meaningful way what that means? It's just too broad a category, because anything can be held up and considered as art. It seems like nothing could be more confusing and mystifying than the present, and it's awesome.